The narrative arc of Robert Roy MacGregor, a figure whose very name conjures images of the mist-shrouded, fiercely independent Scottish Highlands, is an enduring historical puzzle. Was he a courageous freedom fighter, a Scottish Robin Hood defending the disenfranchised tenants against the rapacious nobility? Or was he, at his core, a supremely clever and ruthless criminal, a master extortionist who expertly navigated and manipulated the endemic chaos of his time and age of political upheaval and clan warfare for his own profound personal gain? This fundamental ambiguity, this contested space between the revered legend and the tangible man, has been almost irredeemably blurred, a historical truth lost not only in the literal mists of the Trossachs, but also intentionally obscured by the pervasive, romantic literature and subsequent media that consciously glorified his actions. Long after his death, to even begin to comprehend this iconic figure, one must first immerse oneself in the turbulent, brutal world that was the true forge of his character, a tumultuous society riven by warring clans, profound and destabilizing political instability, and a burgeoning kingdom that was desperately struggling to assert a singular, unified identity. He was born into an era where the sophisticated law of the crown held significantly less practical weight than the ancient law of the glen, and where the very concept of long-term survival was utterly dependent upon a complex web of loyalty, sheer cunning, pragmatic opportunism, and when all else failed, the application of sudden, decisive, and brutal force. The very act of framing the question as a simplistic binary, hero or criminal, might itself be a distinctly modern intellectual distinction, one that possessed very little functional meaning. For a 17th century Highlander whose ancestral name was officially outlawed by the very state he inhabited, MacGregor was a product of the proscription, a master survivor who learned to weaponize his status as an outcast, transforming the state's attempt to erase him into the very foundation of his lasting, complex power. His story is the definitive narrative of resistance in the face of annihilation, a testament to the resilience of the Highland spirit. Before we delve into the heart of this enduring Highland mystery, meticulously tracing the intricate and often contradictory path of Rob Roy MacGregor from a respectable businessman to a reviled outlaw and finally to an internationally celebrated folk hero, if you find yourself captivated and passionate about history, specifically the complex lives of legendary figures, the enduring power of myth, and the challenging truths that often lie hidden beneath historical romanticism, we urge you to take a moment to actively support our channel. Your engagement is the lifeblood of our research. Please hit that like button to signal your appreciation and help the YouTube algorithm propel this video to a wider audience of fellow history enthusiasts. Click subscribe and activate the notification bell so that you are guaranteed never to miss a future episode in our exploration of the world's grandest historical sagas. And most importantly, share this video widely with anyone in your network who cherishes a complex historical narrative, a grand adventure, or a story of defiance against overwhelming power. Every click, every share, and every comment you leave is not merely a metric, it is the vital, tangible support that allows our dedicated team to continue investing the immense time, effort, and resources required to research, film, and produce these deeply detailed, compelling, and free historical documentaries. Born Robert MacGregor in the year 1671, he was ushered into a world fundamentally defined by profound and widespread chaos, a Scotland that was still deeply scarred and reeling from many decades of internal civil war and tumultuous religious strife. The social and political landscape of the late 17th century Highlands was a volatile tinderbox of deeply conflicting, often irreconcilable loyalties. While the restoration of King Charles II in 1660 had settled some issues, it simultaneously ignited numerous others, and the underlying, visceral tensions between the fiercely traditional Highland clans and the increasingly assertive centralized power of the lowland-based government were rapidly accelerating toward an inevitable violent breaking point. Only 17 years after his birth, the pivotal Glorious Revolution of 1688 would violently depose the Catholic Stuart King James VII of Scotland, James II of England, replacing him with William of Orange. This single, cataclysmic event, a constitutional coup d'etat, didn't just change the monarchy, It effectively cleaved the country in two, instantaneously creating the Jacobite cause, the passionate movement to restore the exiled Stuart line, which would rapidly evolve to become the single most dominant, all-consuming political and military reality of Rob Roy's entire adult life. He was therefore not merely a casualty of a chaotic time. He was born directly onto the geopolitical fault line of a dynastic nation-defining war that would provide him with both his greatest opportunities and ultimately define his enduring legacy as a figure who was as much a perceived patriot by his own kin as he was an astute, self-serving opportunist by his rivals. Rob Roy MacGregor was born at Glengyle, a place of profound strategic importance situated at the very head of Loch Katrine, deep within the natural fortress of the Trossachs. This geography is far from incidental. It was a natural strategic fortress, a dense, near-impenetrable landscape of towering mountains and complex bodies of water that was perfectly, uniquely suited for the kind of guerrilla warfare and opportunistic cattle raiding that would later define his adult life. Crucially, he was not born a mere peasant. He was born into the Highland gentry. His father was Donald MacGregor, a deeply respected clan chieftain who held a lieutenant colonel's commission in the military service of the exiled King James. This meant that Rob Roy was immersed from his earliest days in a family with a fiercely proud martial tradition, a deep, unwavering loyalty to the Stuart dynasty, making them natural Jacobites, and a visceral, innate understanding of the complex Highland code of honor, loyalty to the clan, and when necessary, the bloody maintenance of the feud. He likely received a surprisingly decent formal education, setting him apart from the common rival and transforming him into a significantly more formidable, calculating opponent in both business and warfare. This brings us to perhaps the most critically important, single defining factor of Rob Roy's existence. The MacGregor name was proscribed. It had been formally and brutally outlawed by the Crown since the year 1603. This was a devastating legal reality that cast a lifelong shadow over his entire existence. Following the catastrophic Battle of Glenfruin in 1603, King James VI issued a radical and punitive edict that effectively abolished the entire clan, officially proscribed the very name MacGregor, and made it a capital offense to bear it. They were officially declared non-persons, legally designated as broken men, stripped of any legal right to own land, engage in legitimate trade, or even, in a legal sense, to exist. Rob Roy was, therefore, born a legal ghost, compelled by law to use his mother's surname. Campbell, an exquisitely painful irony given the long and bloody enmity that had historically existed between the two clans. This lifelong status as a stateless, proscribed outcast instilled in him a profound, ineradicable distrust of centralized authority and simultaneously a fierce, primal, and deeply survivalist loyalty to his own kin. Long before the devastating feud with the Duke of Montrose, Rob Roy MacGregor was an extraordinarily successful and wholly respectable businessman. He held the esteemed title of a tacksman, a figure of profound significance in the socio-economic structure of the Highlands. The tacksman leased a large area of land attacked directly from the primary landowner, often the powerful Duke of Montrose himself, and would then meticulously sublet smaller plots to individual tenants. His primary and most lucrative enterprise was that of a cattle drover. This was the high-stakes, high-profit business of a major, large-scale commodities trader. The native Highland cattle, or kylos, were the black gold of 17th and 18th century Scotland, representing the primary export to the rapidly expanding markets in the lowlands and, critically, in England. Rob Roy was a major player, responsible for the management of vast herds and the movement of enormous sums of money. The role of a cattle drover was inherently a tough, highly dangerous, and demanding job that necessitated an immense degree of skill, a reputation for genuine bravery, and an absolutely unshakable reputation for honesty. The arduous drove roads to the great markets at Crieff or Falkirk were extraordinarily perilous. A drover was required to constantly defend his cattle, his liquid capital, from opportunistic bands of professional rivers and rustlers. In this precarious world, a man's reputation served as his literal bond and his credit line. Buyers had to trust that he would successfully deliver the promised number of cattle, and sellers had to trust implicitly that he would return with their full, rightful payment. In these early formative years, Rob Roy was widely known as a man of his word, a reliable, highly skilled drover who was explicitly trusted by powerful landowners and lords across the Highlands, including the very man who would later become his most implacable nemesis, James Graham, the Duke of Montrose. Rob Roy MacGregor's life trajectory was fundamentally and irrevocably altered by a single, colossal, and ultimately catastrophic business deal, a transaction that represented the absolute zenith of his early commercial ambition. He borrowed the colossal sum of £1,000, an absolutely enormous fortune at the time, from James Graham, the first Duke of Montrose. Montrose was one of the most powerful noblemen in all of Scotland, a fierce supporter of the new Hanoverian government, and the primary landowner from whom Rob Roy leased the majority of his lands. The money was earmarked for a massive large-scale cattle venture. The ambitious plan was to purchase immense herds from the Outer Isles, fatten them, and then undertake the long, high-risk drove south to England to be sold for a massive profit. This was a highly speculative, yet common, high-risk, high-reward enterprise. The transaction itself was a profound political and social statement, demonstrating the immense, hard-won trust and standing that Rob Roy had successfully managed to build. This trust, however, was fundamentally built upon the extremely fragile foundations of a volatile, unpredictable market and the integrity of the men Rob Roy himself employed. This was intended to be nothing more than a straightforward, though extraordinarily large, commercial investment. Montrose was operating purely as an astute investor who had a clear expectation of a significant return on his capital. The failure was initiated somewhere along the chain of trust. According to the historical record, the entire sum of money, the colossal £1,000, mysteriously vanished. The most charitable story is that his chief drover, a man from the MacDonald clan, simply absconded with the entire sum. Another equally plausible theory suggests that the venture itself was a total, unmitigated disaster, a sudden, brutal onset of a harsh winter, a catastrophic drop in the cattle prices, or a devastating bovine disease could have easily wiped out the entire herd and the massive investment. A third, more cynical theory suggests it was an elaborate setup orchestrated by the Duke himself. The precise historical reason for the loss remains stubbornly opaque, but the outcome was definitive. Rob Roy had taken the Duke's money and could now offer absolutely nothing tangible to show for it. He had, with a single disastrous deal, defaulted on the loan. The high-stakes commercial gamble had failed, transforming his life from a success story into an unrecoverable catastrophe. The Duke of Montrose, being a nobleman of immense power, exhibited absolutely no mercy. From his perspective, the facts were straightforward and damning. He had been swindled by a man from a historically broken, outlawed clan. The Duke's initial response was driven by the cold, crushing, and impersonal power of the law he represented. He immediately had Rob Roy formally declared a notorious bankrupt and a fraudulent debtor, leveraging his political influence to secure the most medieval and devastating legal instrument available, letters of fire and sword. This was, in essence, a state-sanctioned, aristocratic death warrant. It granted Montrose's authorized agents, known as factors, the absolute legal right to relentlessly pursue Rob Roy, to violently seize every piece of his land and property, to burn his house to the ground, and to kill him or any of his followers on sight, without fear of prosecution. In a single, devastating legal pronouncement, Rob Roy's life as a respectable businessman was extinguished. He was forced to choose between death and outlawry. This entire chain of events was compounded by an act that, in Rob Roy's eyes, became intensely personal and emotional, an act that permanently cemented his furious, deeply personal feud with the Duke of Montrose. While Rob Roy was away, Montrose's men, acting under the direct authority of his notoriously ruthless factor, Graham of Killern, forcibly and brutally evicted Rob Roy's wife, Helen MacGregor, and their young children from their family home at Inversnaid. The legends claim this cruel act took place in the depth of a harsh winter, and that the house was systematically burned to the ground. The devastating core truth is historically undisputed. His family was violently dispossessed, his home was taken, and his honor, a concept of paramount importance within the Highland Code, was irrevocably violated. This was an act of deliberate inhumanity that transformed a purely financial dispute into a bloody, personal, and unyielding vendetta. This brutal, public violation of his honor and his family transformed Rob Roy completely and fundamentally. The former respectable businessman was instantaneously gone, violently replaced by a cold, calculating, and deeply vengeful outlaw. He had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. He was also a MacGregor, a man from an outlawed clan, and he reverted to the ancient, proven ways of his persecuted ancestors. He formally declared a private war, a Highland Creech, raid of vengeance against the powerful Duke of Montrose, now a fugitive. Rob Roy embarked on a dangerous, yet highly innovative, new enterprise that would secure his reputation as a criminal mastermind, the infamous black mail racket. He began systematically offering a crucial service to local landowners, particularly targeting the numerous tenants who leased their farms from the Duke of Montrose, protection for their valuable herds, in exchange for a compulsory fee. This was the precise origin of the deeply evocative and infamous term blackmail. In Old Scots, the term mail was the common word for rent or payment. Rob Roy ran a surprisingly sophisticated and highly organized racket that offered a perverse form of private security for a set, non-negotiable fee. Rob Roy and his heavily armed followers would provide a guarantee that the farmer's herd would be completely safe from all rustlers and raiders for the duration of the entire year. It was, in effect, a privately managed, mandatory insurance policy in a lawless land that possessed no effective central police force. The operational mechanism of the blackmail racket was devastatingly simple, psychologically manipulative, and brutally effective. A farmer was presented with a choice to pay him for protection, or Rob Roy could simply not guarantee what sudden, disastrous fate might befall their herds. The source of the potential threat was, of course, very often Rob Roy himself. If a local landowner stubbornly refused to pay the compulsory fee, their valuable cattle would mysteriously vanish overnight, conveniently stolen by an anonymous band of highly skilled drivers. For a significant number of practical farmers, paying Rob Roy's blackmail was simply viewed as a pragmatic, necessary business decision, a predictable annual expense that was invariably far cheaper than facing the catastrophic loss of their entire herd. Rob Roy therefore became the sole, indispensable provider of security in the entire region, albeit a provider who skillfully maintained a near-absolute monopoly on both the provision of security and the deliberate creation of insecurity. In 1715, the political tensions of Scotland finally erupted into a massive, full-scale Jacobite rebellion, a crucial effort aimed at violently restoring the exiled Stuart kings. This critical national crisis was the moment of decision. Rob Roy's specific role was immensely calm, placated, and ambiguous. As a member of the MacGregor clan and a man whose father had served the Stuarts, his personal sympathies were undeniably and passionately Jacobite. His great enemy, the Duke of Montrose, was a primary supporter of the Hanoverian government. This conflict gave Rob Roy the absolute, perfect cover and strategic advantage. He could now prosecute his intense private war against Montrose's lands, stealing his cattle and disrupting his rents, all under the high-minded veneer of patriotic action for the legitimate Jacobite cause. He was undeniably present with his armed men at the Battle of Sheriffmuir, the decisive yet deeply ambiguous battle of the entire Rising, but his actions there cemented his lasting reputation not as a pure ideologue, but as a cunning, deeply self-interested opportunist. The question of whether Rob Roy was a true ideological believer in the Jacobite cause, or simply a pragmatic opportunist masterfully leveraging the chaos of a national civil war to prosecute his own intense private feud, is a persistent historical debate. The overwhelming evidence strongly suggests the latter. At the critical Battle of Sheriffmuir, contemporary accounts place Rob Roy and his armed MacGregors strategically positioned on the periphery, keenly observing the main fray but consciously never fully committing to the major, costly charge. He was notoriously and widely accused of standing aloof, patiently waiting to see which side would win, so that he could safely plunder the valuable baggage train of the defeated army. His primary strategic goal was clearly not to die for a Stuart king, but rather to exploit the massive distraction to ruthlessly raid the lands of Montrose's government-allied neighbors. His fight was not for a crown, it was, first and foremost, for the immediate survival and profit of Clan MacGregor, and for the satisfaction of his own personal revenge. Legends surrounding Rob Roy's daring exploits grew rapidly, often focusing on his knack for humiliating Montrose's factors or agents with a theatrical, almost comedic flair. These stories became the essential bedrock of his folk hero status among the common people, who resented the Duke's power. His most frequent and beloved target was John Graham of Killern, the factor who had personally overseen the brutal eviction of his wife. In one of the most famous anecdotes, Rob Roy and his men daringly abducted Killern, who was carrying a substantial sum of the Duke's rent money. Rob Roy held the factor prisoner, treated him with ironic courtesy, and then casually borrowed the entire sum of rent money in a final, mocking flourish. He famously sent the Duke a formal, sarcastic receipt for the sum. These were meticulously calculated insults, perfectly designed to publicly enrage the Duke and expertly portray him to his own tenants as utterly powerless to stop the outlaw. However, the most persistent and romantic part of the MacGregor legend is the notion that he was a benevolent figure who was actively giving to the poor. The full-fledged Robin Hood narrative is now almost universally recognized by historians as a significantly later embellishment, a purely romantic flourish cemented by Sir Walter Scott's novel. Crucially, there is no credible contemporary evidence to suggest that Rob Roy ever engaged in any form of generalized, selfless wealth redistribution. He was not a social revolutionary. However, as the de facto chieftain of the MacGregor men, he did bear an ancient, non-negotiable responsibility to his tenants, his kinsmen, and all those who actively lived under his unique protection. He provided for his people, protecting his paying tenants from other raiders and supporting the widows and families of his own followers. Therefore, his charity was not social justice, it was the ancient, practical, deeply rooted loyalty and obligation inherent in the clan system. Rob Roy demonstrated a breathtaking degree of political audacity by frequently and masterfully playing his most powerful enemies directly against each other. His primary feud was with the Duke of Montrose, but Montrose had his own massive rival, John Murray, the first Duke of Atholl. Rob Roy masterfully exploited their deep, mutual hatred. Whenever Montrose's men pursued him, Rob Roy would simply cross the border onto Atholl's extensive lands, where he had sought and successfully received a form of strategic protection. Atholl would then deliberately and publicly shelter the outlaw, because the act of doing so deeply and spectacularly infuriated Montrose. Rob Roy thus became a highly valuable strategic pawn in their aristocratic chess game, inevitably. Despite his extreme cunning, Rob Roy's extraordinary luck finally ran out. The Duke of Atholl, likely facing intense political pressure from the central Hanoverian government, finally concluded that the troublesome rival was more trouble than his strategic worth. In the year 1717, using a pretext of a supposedly safe meeting, Atholl had Rob Roy immediately seized and imprisoned. He was chained and confined within Logirate Castle, and his downfall seemed utterly certain. He had become a pawn who had tragically overplayed his hand. Yet, as was common in his life, he managed an extraordinary escape. Legend suggests his sister or his wife ingeniously smuggled a rope into his cell, but his physical and political position was more precarious than it had ever been. He was now actively hunted by the full forces of both Montrose and Atholl, the two greatest landowners in the region. Years later, Rob Roy was imprisoned again and ultimately destined for a slow, agonizing transportation to the colonies, a fate considered a living death. For an aging man of his station, his epic story seemed to be completely over. He was an aging man, physically broken, his intense fight for survival extinguished. He was shipped to London and held in the infamous Newgate prison, a fetid, disease-ridden hellhole, awaiting the next vessel. He was a physically broken figure, thousands of miles from the protective glens that had been his sanctuary for so long. Then, in one of the most remarkable twists of his life, a profound miracle happened, one that was born not of the strength of arms, but of the sudden, powerful influence of literature and the press. In the year 1723, precisely while Rob Roy MacGregor was languishing in the darkness of Newgate, The renowned author Daniel Defoe published a sensational, highly fictionalized biography titled The Highland Rogue. The book was an immediate, stunning blockbuster throughout London's reading public. It consciously painted Rob Roy as a dashing, noble savage, a gentleman rogue forced into a life of crime. He instantly became an overnight celebrity. In 1727, just as he was about to be forcibly put onto the transport ship bound for the colonies, an official, full royal pardon miraculously arrived from King George I. His newfound celebrity, directly fueled by the sensationalism of a popular pulp novel, had literally saved his life. It stood as a stunning testament to the emerging, transformative power of the popular press. Fully pardoned by the king, Rob Roy MacGregor was finally able to return to his beloved Scotland. He was now in his late 50s, his health failing, and the intense fire for his old feud with Montrose had visibly burned out. Rob Roy quietly settled in the village of Balquhidder, living out his final years in a state of relative peace, now under the official protection of his mother's kin, the Campbells of Breadalbane. He was no longer a rival or a blackmail boss, but a deeply respected, though still notorious, elder, a genuine living legend. He formally reverted to his given name, Robert Campbell, and lived out his final decade as a quiet tenant farmer. In one final, surprising, and deeply symbolic twist, the great Presbyterian-born warrior and outlaw converted to Roman Catholicism late in life. This was a historically baffling move in a country where the state church was fiercely Presbyterian. Some historians speculate it was a final, quiet act of Jacobite defiance, a spiritual rejection of the state that had hunted him. Others suggest it was a genuine, late-life search for spiritual solace. He died peacefully in his own bed in Balquhidder on December 28, 1734. Legend has it that he commanded his personal piper to play Hatil Me Tulid, meaning, "We return no more," a final, deeply fitting, and melancholic farewell. His death marked the end of the man, but the true beginning of the legend. The man was dead, but the vibrant, enduring legend was just beginning its transformation into myth. For decades after his death, his story was meticulously kept alive in Highland folklore. Then, in the pivotal year of 1817, nearly a full century after his royal pardon, the colossal literary figure Sir Walter Scott published his monumental and immensely influential novel, Rob Roy. Scott, fascinated by the disappearing, romantic culture of the Highlands, immediately recognized in this complex, ambiguous figure the absolute perfect protagonist to explore his favorite literary theme, the dramatic clash of cultures, the violent collision between the old world of fierce Highland honor and the new, unforgiving world of lowland law and commercialism. Scott's novel was an international blockbuster, a cultural phenomenon that fundamentally and forever reshaped Rob Roy's image. Scott was a master storyteller, but he was a romantic novelist, not a meticulous historian. He deliberately took the morally gray, pragmatic, and often brutal outlaw and systematically sanded off his roughest edges. Scott's version of Rob Roy is a noble, tragic figure, a gentleman chieftain tragically forced into outlawry. He is consistently portrayed as a man of profound deep honor and romantic courage, a selfless protector of the weak. This heavily romanticized version, written specifically for a Georgian-era audience hungry for exotic Highland adventure, became the single definite public one, completely eclipsing the far more complex historical reality of the original man. Scott's novel achieved more than just literary success. It transformed Rob Roy into a powerful, permanent cultural symbol. He became the quintessential tartan hero, a figure of defiant Highland spirit successfully resisting the oppressive encroachment of lowland and English culture. This transformation occurred at a politically crucial moment in Scottish history, following the final, disastrous Jacobite rising of 1745. Highland culture had been brutally suppressed. Scott's novel, which was part of a broader, powerful tartan revival, helped to make Highland culture suddenly fashionable, politically safe, and deeply romantic again for the wider British public. Rob Roy, the symbol, became a crucial, essential part of Scotland's new, evolving national identity. This idealized image, though utterly divorced from historical fact, successfully captured the romantic spirit of a lost way of life and became a crucial, profitable component of Scottish national identity, the once feared, savage Highlander, was now consciously reframed as a noble warrior, whose martial spirit could be safely harnessed for the Empire's new Highland regiments. The wild, rebellious spirit of Rob Roy was effectively tamed, safely memorialized in plaid, and then actively sold to the world as a palatable symbol of Scottish pride and valor, a sophisticated process of cultural transformation that continues to be exploited in global tourism and media to this very day. The historical bandit became a lucrative national brand. So, who was the real Robert Roy MacGregor? Was he a ruthless survivor expertly playing a dangerous, high-stakes game? Without a single doubt, he was a brilliant, opportunistic tactician who utilized the complex terrain, clan rivalries, and political chaos of his age to consistently survive and even prosper against impossible odds. Was he a loyal clansman pushed too far by aristocratic cruelty? Absolutely. His most decisive actions were primarily driven by a fierce loyalty to his kin and a burning desire for revenge. Or was he a genuine romantic hero, only in the pages of a novel? The true historical Rob Roy was harder, colder, more calculating, and infinitely more dangerous than the sanitized hero of Scots fiction. He was the ultimate product of his state-imposed proscription, a man legally erased by the central government who was forced to personally write his own name, his own law, and his own moral code. In the glens, using the profitable currency of blackmail and the undeniable efficacy of a ready sword, the enduring legacy of Rob Roy MacGregor is that he is, in a profound and complex sense, all of them. The legend, however, is a timeless, necessary story of personal defiance against overwhelming power. His true importance lies in that compelling, enduring, and profitable misty blur between the man and the myth.